Star Trek Voyager, Starfleet Academy, Quarantine, Chapter 3. Shatub was only a few 100,000 kilometers away when the Tsiolkovsky came out of warp. Kathryn was fully awake now and finally standing next to Science Officer Lieutenant Commander Emma Tapper at the bridge's science station. Kathryn could see almost everything from the aft section of the bridge when she turned from her science monitor, including the large view screen that covered almost a third of the far bridge wall. She had a hard time ignoring the view screen. It was the first time she'd ever seen stars when a ship was in warp drive, the elongated shapes cut by a spectrum of color. Dragging her eyes from the view screen, she noted the other cadets standing next to their assigned officers. Laswa Rana was standing next to the navigator station. Marie Lecoux was next to the helm, and Blinar was to the right of Captain Wingate's chair. Only Timothy Wang was missing, assigned to the engineering room several decks down. Impulse power, Mr. Wright, ordered the captain to the helmsman. As Marie watched, Lieutenant Wright pressed several templates. "Aye, sir," Wright responded. "Planet in visual range, sir." "Magnify." Lieutenant Wright leaned back and allowed Marie to enter the magnification codes. Kathryn couldn't help it. She was staring at the view screen again. The planet's surface suddenly filled the entire screen. There were numerous deep blue oceans and small seas, 2 large land masses, mixes of yellows and browns with patches of green, were on this side of the planet. Kathryn also spotted a tiny moon traveling across the face of Shatub, cutting between the ship and the planet. But even more striking were the domes that covered parts of the upper continent. It looked like huge lumps on the skin of the planet's surface. Kathryn was amazed by the dome's structural design, a crisscrossing of tall metal beams and thick crystal posts. The outside of the domes seemed to be covered with diamonds, sparkling from the reflection of Shatub's sun. Kathryn suddenly realized that solar cell panels probably created the effect as they collected the much-needed energy from the nearest star. "ETA 10 minutes to orbit, sir," said Wright, breaking the silence. 10 minutes? Responded the captain. He spun in his chair and turned to Blinar. "And what do we know about this planet, Mr. Blinar?" Kathryn rolled her eyes as Blinar stood ramrod straight in front of the captain. "He just seems to try too hard," she thought, looking back at her monitor. "Sir," Blinar began, "we know that Shatub is an M-class planet. We know that the first brief long-distance contact with the planet's people was made at least 10 years ago by the Klingons." He recited, his raspy voice making Kathryn uneasy. "They claimed that Shatub were on the verge of solar system exploration. It is a domed society, and the Shatub government indicated that the planet's air had not been fit to breathe for about one standard Earth century, polluted with chemicals and bacteria by industrial groups, and they claim it was the fault of the old government." He paused and took a deep breath before continuing. "The Shatub people are humanoid, all with white hair, light olive skin, flat ears, 3 fingers, and their large eyes can see visible, and a small amount of infrared light, sir." Captain Wingate smiled at the Teji. "Very impressive, Mr. Blinar, but you forgot one thing. Shatub has 2 major cultures, the Chat and the others. The Chats run the government at the moment." Blinar's ears wiggled slightly. "I didn't think that was important, sir." Captain Wingate was still smiling. "Every piece of information is important, cadet, even if it seems trivial to you at the moment." Kathryn was half listening to the conversation. Right now, she was intent on the readings coming from the planet. She ran a sensor scan, then tried it again. It gave her the same answer. Something was wrong here. Maybe something with the sensors? Lieutenant Tapper? Yes, Cadet Janeway, answered the science officer, turning from listening to the exchange between the captain and Blinar. Would you please check me on this? Kathryn's hands were starting to sweat. Captain Wingate turned in the direction of the science station. Something wrong, Cadet Janeway? Sir, I don't understand it, she said, hesitating. She looked from Lieutenant Tapper to the captain and took a deep breath. According to the readings, the air on the planet is breathable by human standards. The science officer nodded in confirmation. Explanation? The captain asked. I don't know, sir, Kathryn said. She turned to the science officer, then back to the monitor. According to the sensors, Kathryn continued, there was an apparent problem with the air maybe a half-century ago, chemicals, bacteria, and such, but not much anymore. In fact, the domes seem to have more pollutants inside than they do outside. She looked up at the captain. And, sir, the domes are apparently connected by underground tunnels, and they have even more pollutants on the outside. Lieutenant Tapper nodded in agreement at the captain. Then why do they still insist on living in the domes? Captain Wingate said, almost to himself. All right, Janeway, Tapper, I want answers. See if the people on the planet can't stand something in the atmosphere that humans can, and that's why they're still living in the domes. Or see if there's some type of natural hazard out there that might harm the population. I want all the possibilities explored. Aye, sir. Kathryn's fingers flew over the panel's templates as Science Officer Tapper looked over her left shoulder. Suddenly, Kathryn noticed someone was standing on her right. It was Blinar. Let me know if you need help, Lieutenant Commander Tapper, he said smugly, looking down his bumpy nose at the officer. I did quite well on the sensor analysis. Test entered the academy. And as the captain will tell you, it's best for a captain to know all the systems on his bridge. Janeway bit her lip in anger and tried to concentrate on her task. She knew what she was doing. She didn't need Blinar pushing his way into her work, especially something this important. I think you're running under a misconception, Mr. Blinar, said the science officer, folding her arms across her chest. A captain allows his crew to do their work as a well-functioning team, Mr. Blinar, and Cadet Janeway is doing her job very well. Blinar scowled, his ears twitching once. Yes, it's a good point. He turned slowly and walked back to stand next to the captain. Kathryn looked at Lieutenant Tapper and smiled. Thanks for the support. You deserve it, she said, leaning over to get closer to the monitor. The coffee. Now I just can't see why they insist on living in those domes. Why would they report such bad contamination conditions? Kathryn noticed the green glow from the environmental readings remained steady as she scanned the entire planet, meaning there were few pollutants in the air. I have no idea, she said, shaking her head. Maybe their sensors aren't as good as ours, but don't worry, I'll figure it out while I'm down on the planet. The science officer raised an eyebrow and laughed. And what makes you think you're going on the away team? She asked. Commander Pago Pago, said the captain, suddenly turning to his first officer. I want you, Dr. Tess, and Tabasa, and all 5 of the cadets on the away team. We'll contact the chats and tell them you'll soon be on your way. It was Kathryn's turn to raise an eyebrow. She smiled at a surprised Lieutenant Commander Tapper and headed for the turbolift. Tobasa do this, Tobasa do that. I joined Starfleet to treat people, not carry packages to other planets. Dr. Benny at Tobasa grabbed another small box in his huge hands and carried it to a transporter pad. They're not just packages, Benia, answered Dr. Hess. It's medical equipment, and we're trying to help these people, remember? Right. But just for once, can't we send down something that doesn't weigh at least 200 pounds? Why not just send down a bunch of medical tricorders? That would be enough to keep them going for a while. Kathryn carried another box to the transporter platform and smiled. For 10 minutes, she and the other cadets stacked boxes for transport and listened to Drs. Hess and Tobasa toss comments back and forth. Apparently, it didn't matter what time of the day it was. Kathryn noticed that Dr. Tobasa just loved to complain. It doesn't weigh 200 pounds, Benny, Dr. Hess continued. She looked over at the cadets, helping to load the cargo on the transporter pads. And you're giving these young cadets the wrong idea about what it's like to be a doctor in Starfleet Medical. Are any of you going to be a doctor? Dr. Tobasa asked, his loud voice echoing around the transporter room. All the cadets shook their heads. There you go, Sarah. These cadets don't want to deliver medical equipment. They want to become starship captains, right? Without waiting for an answer, he continued, You don't see the captain down here loading equipment, do you? Dr. Hess shook her head at Kathryn and wiped her forehead with her shirt sleeve. Don't listen to him. He just came back from a wonderfully relaxing vacation in Earth's Antarctica. You know, the penguin rookery. Then he had to go on this mission, so he's a bit cranky. Kathryn smiled, realizing that all Dr. Hess seemed to do was make excuses for her colleague. All right, cadets, I think we're ready. Hess to bridge. Bridge here, came the captain's crisp reply. Ready to transport, Captain. 70 pounds of equipment, she said, pointedly looking at Dr. Tobasa, along with 2 doctors and 5 cadets, ready to go. Good, he replied. Commander Pago Pago and 2 security officers will follow you down directly. Kathryn stood on the transporter platform and checked to make sure she had her comm badge and science tricorder. As Dr. Hess gave the order to energize, Kathryn closed her eyes. It was a habit she picked up years ago when she first transported with her father to Starfleet headquarters in San Francisco from her home in Indiana. Even though she had heard how safe and easy it was to be transported, she still was scared. But she wouldn't let her father know. So she closed her eyes, thought about her favorite climbing tree. Before she knew what was happening, she was on the far side of the continent. This time, too, she closed her eyes and opened them to see 6 tall humanoids bowing in front of her. The tallest of the group held up his right hand, his 3 long, thin fingers outstretched in a sign of greeting. Welcome to Chatub, he said, his sharp, deep voice speaking so fast that Kathryn had a hard time understanding him. All right, I'll try to do this. His hair seemed to move as if he were in a breeze. I am Governor Nima. I and my officials welcome you to our government headquarters. Kathryn watched as Dr. Hess returned his gesture and nodded slightly. Commander Pago Pago and 2 security officers materialized, and the commander, too, saluted the governor with the Chatub greeting. As the commander introduced his away team, Kathryn tried to stand at attention and look straight ahead. But out of the corner of her eye, she studied the Chatub people. Just as her mission profile mentioned, the Chatub had vivid white hair and large sky-blue eyes. The 2 females wore their hair in long braids, while the men's hair stood up straight and spiked. 6 small, round metal dots circled their flat ears. The 3 fingers on each hand were long and thin, decorated with rings of many colors. All of the officials were dressed in extremely neat, crisp uniforms. rich-looking dark blue jackets, trimmed across the chest in braids of red and green, and what looked like real gold. The pants were also lined along the sides with gold, ending with a round medallion. Just below the jacket cuff on the left wrist, the officials wore what looked like a small rose, each a different color. "And these are the Starfleet Academy cadets Captain Wingate mentioned," the commander was saying, introducing each of the cadets in turn. Cadets. Cadets. I need some coffee here. Cadets," Governor Olnema said quickly, turning to the cadets. He raised his nose and seemed to sniff the air, his spikes of hair waving. "I am pleased you are here to witness a joint cooperation between our two peoples." He looked at Kathryn. "And I see you are interested in our attire, cadet, especially our wrist watchers." One long finger pointed to his wrist, and he sniffed again toward Kathryn. "What was your name again?" "Janeway, sir. Cadet Kathryn Janeway," she said, trying hard to keep up with his rapid speech. She found herself talking almost as fast as the Chatube leader. "Kathryn, we have a word that is similar in our language. It means seeker." He pulled at his jacket sleeve, revealing his left wrist. "And the wrist watchers, you may ask? They tell us whether or not there are any leaks of noxious gases from outside of the dome seeping into our world. They are called tana flowers of the heatheroob family and are quite profuse. Everyone in the dome wears one all of the time, and if they wither in any way, it is an indication that gases are present." Governor Olnema seemed to shudder, his hair waving more rapidly, almost in time with his voice. "Sounds familiar," said Pago Pago, standing closer to the governor to look at the wrist watcher. "We used to extract mineral and metal resources from mines deep in the earth centuries ago on our planet. They used a certain bird called a canary to detect if there were any bad gases in the mine. If the canary died, it was a good bet that the air wasn't fit for humans either." Kathryn shifted slightly as everyone waited for Governor Olnema's response. He sniffed at the air, said nothing, and turned his attention to the cadets again. "You're all welcome here, and if you don't mind, we would like you to wear the wrist watchers during your stay." He watched as each person in the Tsiolkovsky group was given a tana flower. The governor suddenly frowned, his large forehead wrinkling over his wide eyes. "But I must warn you, do not explore the outside of this complex, and do not talk to anyone outside of my officials. Although my people know you are here, they are very cautious around visitors, and of course, do not wander outside of the dome." As Kathryn took the bright yellow tana flower handed to her by one of the officials, she glanced at the first officer. "That's great," she thought. "Now I'll never figure out what's wrong with the air outside the dome. There goes my chance to impress the captain and Emma Tapper." The morning went slowly. Marie, Timothy, and Blinar unloaded each box. Kathryn and the lost one noted its contents and checked it off on their data pads. Doctors Hess and Tabasa would then instruct the Chatube officials how to use the instrument. But it was a long process. The Chatube often wanted something explained at least 4 or 5 times, and Kathryn wondered if they couldn't understand the doctor's slower speech. She admired Dr. Hess's patience, not only in dealing with the Chatube, but with the complaining Dr. Tabasa. "I think that's the end of the heater packs," said Kathryn, showing her datapad to Dr. Hess. "Commander Pago Pago just beamed up to the Tsiolkovsky to check on the last boxes to be transported." Dr. Hess nodded and looked over Kathryn's shoulder at the datapad. "Looks like we're doing fine." She looked around the large room. "Did you notice crystals in the windows around here, Kathryn?" Kathryn nodded and pointed directly overhead. "That one is beautiful, especially when the artificial sunlight from the dome generator hits it just right." Do you think the crystals are natural? You're the scientist, Dr. Hess said, chuckling. You tell me. Kathryn pulled out her tricorder and began scanning, spinning around to take in the entire crystal. That's strange. Hess! Came a booming voice. The commander just checked in. Only 2 more boxes coming our way. Let's hurry up. This wristwatcher is making me itch, he said, moving the flower farther up his arm and out of the way. Dr. Hess nodded to Dr. Tabasa, then turned back to Kathryn. Is something wrong? No, not really. I just had a weird reading. Now it's gone. Dr. Hess hesitated, then leaned closer to Kathryn. Listen, you told me earlier you wanted to find out more about the air outside the dome. So why don't you look around? Check out the crystals and take some tricorder readings. I know this complex isn't far from the outside of the dome. Kathryn brightened. Then I can find out what's going on around here, she thought. That sounds like a great idea, Dr. Hess, she said out loud. I'm sure we can handle the rest, right, Benia? Sure, with a few more 100 pounds of boxes. As Dr. Hess frowned in mock anger at her colleague, Kathryn walked over to Laswa. Time for a break, she said, then turned to the other cadets. Let's take a look at this building. Kathryn, said Timothy, bowing in her direction. My muscles thank you. Don't get swell-headed, Kathryn, responded Marie. He has no muscles. As the 5 cadets walked down a nearby corridor, Kathryn was amazed how the walls seemed to shift in a prismatic effect as light struck the crystals. Timothy ran his hand along the sleek, colorful wall. It almost looks as if this wall and every other wall and ceiling around here is made entirely of crystal. It's like a crystal palace. Kathryn nodded and ran her tricorder up and down the sides of the hallway. It's some kind of quartz-like crystal, but it's almost flawless. I had no idea the Chatub people had such skills. I wonder if they grow these crystals to be this large. Maybe they mine them? Asked Marie. Maybe, answered Kathryn. But on Earth, quartz crystals don't grow this large, and if they did, they would have too many flaws in them, like bubbles and pieces of organics. So they have to be manufactured, right? Asked Laswa, touching the wall gently with the tip of her index finger. Blinar suddenly sighed, walking in front of the group. Manufactured, mined, or from eggs laid by Legelian starfish, he said, his ears moving back and forth in frustration. Who cares how this rock was made? Timothy stood in front of Blinar, squinting his eyes. Well, maybe some of us are interested in the world around us. Maybe some of us aren't trying to act like we know everything all the time. Oh, yeah? Yeah. Well, I suppose you think that I... Wait a minute, Kathryn interrupted, ignoring the 2 cadets and turning in a small circle. Quiet for a minute. There's something here. She tapped a tricorder template twice. There, she said, pointing toward the end of the hallway. That reading again. It's in that direction. Kathryn walked ahead of the others, moving down the long corridor and stopping at the end. To the left was a dead end. To the right was a short hallway with a large windowed door at the end. Her tricorder began to hum again, and as she looked into the window, Kathryn gasped. Standing there was a shawled, bent-over, old female Chatub, her 3 wrinkled fingers grasping the handle of a dark-colored cane. Kathryn turned to the others. Over here, she yelled, and as she turned back to the window, the old woman was gone. Surprised, she shook her head. Was she just imagining it? If she wasn't, why would such a ragged-looking person be in the government building? Especially when everyone else in the complex was dressed so neatly. And why did she keep getting such strange readings on her tricorder, especially when she pointed the instrument in the old woman's direction? Looking back, she saw the others arguing and realized they hadn't heard her yell. Kathryn easily made up her mind. It was better to check this herself and try to attract the cadets' attention. Kathryn knew it would just take too long. And anyway, she thought, maybe this door leads to doors to the outside of the dome. Holding her tricorder in front of her, she moved cautiously down the short hallway to the door. The strange emissions were completely gone now, disappearing like the old woman. She put her hand on the doorknob just as someone placed a hand on her shoulder. Kathryn, what are you doing? Kathryn jumped. Laswa, she exclaimed. Don't ever do that. We did not see you all of the sudden, she said, then pointed to the others standing behind her. We thought you disappeared. No, but someone else did, she said, explaining to the others about the old woman and the strange readings on her tricorder. I was just going to see where she went, she added, turning the doorknob. The door swung open slowly. Kathryn was in the lead, with the 4 cadets following close behind. For some reason, Kathryn and the others tiptoed in the room, almost as if they were entering the academy library. There was another small hallway and another door, this time with a smaller crystal window. Again, Kathryn turned the doorknob and the cadets stepped through the open door, entering a small room no bigger than her dorm room. Fixtures along the ceiling bathed the room in a bright yellow light. I wonder what this room was for, asked Marie, squinting his eyes. These lights look like the ones that simulate sunlight in the greenhouses and hydro chambers. Where are the plants? Asked Laswa, almost in a whisper. I don't know, answered Blinar firmly, his ears going flat against his head. But I think we should go back and help Dr. Hess unload the rest of the boxes. Not go on some wild duck chase. It's goose chase, replied Timothy, rolling his eyes. Well, I just want to find out if I'm going crazy, explained Kathryn, shading her eyes and looking around the empty room. Plus, if I can learn anything about the air outside the domes, I'd... Before Kathryn finished her sentence, the door they entered slammed shut. Just as suddenly, alarms started chiming and ringing. She dropped her tricorder and covered her ears to shut out the noise. The instrument bounced across the room. As Kathryn watched in dismay, a thick metal plate slid over the exit, crushing the tricorder under its weight. They all covered their ears, but it was no use. The ringing was so loud it was painful. Kathryn saw Laswa's lips moving, but it was impossible to hear her. Then suddenly the lights went out, and even though the alarms still blared, Kathryn was sure she heard Marie's voice. We're trapped! Chapter 4. Kathryn reached her arms forward, trying to forget that her ears hurt from the noise. Feeling the cool wall, she worked her way back toward the direction of the door they had entered. Suddenly, her fingers came in contact with the thick, hard seam, and she knew she had reached the sealed door. Ignoring the painful noise, she tried to move the metal seal by wedging her fingers in the seam and pulling hard. Ouch! She yelled, but the ringing was still so loud she couldn't hear her own voice. The metal cover wouldn't budge. As the klaxons continued to blare, Kathryn thought she heard someone trying to yell above the noise. And if we just... Maybe if you... Can everyone hear me? It was Blinar trying to yell orders to the others, but to no avail. Suddenly the alarm stopped. Kathryn felt her ears ringing. She shook her head, but the ringing continued. Hey, can anyone hear us? Yelled Timothy. He turned to Laswa. You have a loud voice. Start yelling. Laswa looked hurt and confused for a second, then realized it might help. Is anyone out there? Can you hear us? She started yelling, her voice bouncing off the walls of the small room. Kathryn held her ears again. Wait, said Blinar, holding up his hand, his ears twitching quickly. Do you hear us something? Just my ears ringing louder than a town filled with church bells, replied Marie. Suddenly he tilted his head, listening, and as he did, Kathryn took her hands from her ears and listened too. There was a slow ticking noise, as if someone were tapping on the wall. The tapping became louder and faster. Noise started to fill the room again, but it was the sound of gears creaking and grinding slowly. As the noises became louder and louder, Kathryn caught a movement out of the corner of her eye. Circle! Pattern Delta! Blinar yelled. It was the best way to protect each other and to see what was going on. The five cadets rapidly formed a circle, their backs to each other. As they watched, two of the solid walls began to rise, revealing huge crystal windows on opposite sides of the room. Through the window opposite Kathryn was Governor Olnema and several of his officers, all standing at attention and with looks of disgust on their long faces. Kathryn heard Laswa gasp loudly behind her. Turning, she saw what made her Hasek roommate cry out. The second wall window on the other side of the room revealed a grim sight. Dozens of bedraggled chatubs, many in makeshift beds, staring at the cadets through the window. Kathryn thought she saw the old woman, but she couldn't make out the figure in the dimly lit room. I am shocked, Federation cadets, said Governor Olnema, his severe voice resounding over a loudspeaker in the small sealed room. He sighed heavily, his spiked hair beginning to wave as he sniffed the air, then continued in his rapid speech. You were told not to wander outside of our complex. We thought your people had a bit more sense than to go against the laws of our people. I'll handle this, sis, Blinar whispered to the others and stepped forward. Governor Olnema, he said loudly, we broke no laws, and we did not wander outside of the complex. We have witnesses that you, Governor, we were only meters away from where we transported down. Blinar interrupted, his hissing becoming more pronounced. We have witnesses, Nema said, talking over Blinar, his words almost running together as he yelled over the communications panel, that you were outside the complex. Blinar's ears twitched madly as he started to lunge toward the huge window. Laswa put her hand on his shoulder. No, Blinar, what are you going to do? Crush through the window? Kathryn nodded in agreement and said, Let's hear what he has to say. Governor Olnema leaned toward one of his officers and whispered in his ear. The official nodded, sniffed once, and whispered back. It is unfortunate, the governor said, clearing his voice, that you did not listen to our instructions. My assistant now informs me that you have all been exposed to a deadly disease, one that is a grave threat to many of our people. We wiped it out once, but it is now back. What? That's absurd, said Blinar, moving again toward the window. This time Kathryn and Laswa held him back. Timothy slapped his chest to activate his communicator. Cadet Wang to Silkovsky, come in, Bridge. Cadet Wang's Governor Olnema cleared his throat again and looked at Timothy, his large blue eyes flashing in anger. Your communicators do not work in the scaled room? Anyway, as I was saying, you have all been contaminated and will remain quarantined until further notice in the Great Hall. You can see it through that window. Governor Nima said, pointing toward the window on the opposite wall. And who are those tubes in that room? Asked Marie, moving to stand next to Kathryn. Governor Nima looked as if he had just swallowed a bug. I think I had swallowed a bug. He sniffed 3 times quickly, like Trump. They're contaminated tubes. We can do little for them. His face suddenly changed back to normal. You will be pleased to know that the other Federation people are safe. We told them to return to their ship immediately with the news of your exposure to the disease. I'm sure both our governments would readily agree that we do not want any further incidents such as this. He turned to several officers and began talking in a low voice. Kathryn shook her head. She couldn't believe it. How could they have been contaminated just by walking into a room? Governor Onima, she said, catching his attention. How could we have been exposed to a disease? All we did was walk down a hall and into a room. Ah, yes, Cadet. Let's see. Kathryn Janeway, isn't it? Kathryn nodded. It is a yellow room you're in, and all yellow rooms are quarantine rooms, Cadet. They are prime breeding grounds for the plague. Plague? She whispered. Governor Nima spoke so fast that Kathryn wasn't sure she'd heard the word correctly. Yes, plague, he repeated, his voice booming around the tiny room. We call it the Cillian plague. Kathryn shivered. She had heard of plagues back on Earth, but it was almost 3 centuries since the last outbreak. She remembered reading about several plagues during the Middle Ages of Earth's history, especially one called the bubonic plague that wiped out almost 1/4 of the population of Europe. She shivered again. Our ship, said Blinar, his voice shaking and ears still twitching quickly. Kathryn noticed that Teji was visibly trying to control his temper. May we talk to the Tsiolkovsky? Governor Onima leaned over and listened as one of his officials whispered in his ear again. He shook his head, then turned to Blinar. In a while, but in the meantime, I must ask you to remove your contaminated clothing. Communicators. Our communicators? Interrupted Timothy. We may need them. We don't know your people and how you react to such events, and we certainly don't want to take the chance that someone will beam out from the Great Hall, exposing my people to the plague. Federation human. Plus, your uniforms, communicators, and tricorders are contaminated, and they must be destroyed. We will allow you to communicate with your ship with our communications panel inside the Great Hall, he said, sniffing and pointing to the room filled with tubes. You will change into new clothes, now being sent through a tube in the Great Hall. After you change, you will put your contaminated goods in the chute to be destroyed. Food will be provided in the Great Hall at certain hours. Not specific, just certain hours. During certain hours. We will try to keep you comfortable for as long as possible. Stunned, Kathryn and the others walked slowly into the Great Hall. The sick and dying were everywhere, and the room smelled like a mixture of pungent cleaning fluid, sweat, and old cooked food. Kathryn had seen sick people before, but never so many all at once and in such squalid conditions. She grabbed at Laswa as the Hasik tripped over a moaning tube male, his face covered with red blisters. Thanks, Kathryn, she mumbled, shuddering as she continued across the room. Kathryn noticed that the sight of the sick tube didn't seem to bother Timothy and Blinar. They were easily working their way across the hall toward the tube, but Kathryn had to stop at one point and pull Marie along, his face pale as he stared at the sick tubes around him. Somehow, the cadets all managed to change into their new clothing, each getting a dark brown tunic and baggy pants that smelled of mildew. As they dumped their contaminated uniforms and equipment into the chute, Kathryn balled her fists in anger and sadness. It seemed so unfair. It was her first starship uniform and communicator, and I was gone. Crushed by a machine on a distant planet. Cadet Kathryn Janeway, came the rapid voice of Governor O'Neill over the speaker as the chute closed. You may call your ship now. I believe that's my job, said Blynar, moving in front of Kathryn. Governor O'Neill shook his head hard, his spiked hair waving quickly. And although Kathryn didn't think it was possible, his eyes widened as he pointed a long finger at Kathryn. No, I said her, he yelled. Kathryn put her hand on Blynar's shoulder, then turned and walked to the nearby wall. She hesitated as she looked at the alien communications panel. Suddenly, a three-fingered hand reached over her and pushed 2 red templates on the panel. It was a tall male Chatub, his thin face cut by a long blue scar. Thanks, she managed to say. Kathryn cleared her throat nervously. Cadet Janeway to Tsiolkovsky. Janeway to the Tsiolkovsky. Cadet, came the familiar voice of Captain Wingate. If it were not for the circumstances, Kathryn would have smiled when she saw the captain's face over the communications panel. Yes, sir, we have a problem. Yes, I heard, he said. Is everyone all right? So far, but we've all been exposed to some sort of plague. They call it the Cillian plague. Doctor, said the captain, looking over his shoulder. Kathryn watched as Doctors Hess and Tabasa entered into view on the screen. Kathryn, said Dr. Hess, frowning and leaning toward the screen. Kathryn noticed even Tabasa looked concerned. Can you tell us anything at all about the plague? Nothing, Dr. Hess. But apparently there are plenty of people with the plague in this room. Kathryn hesitated, looking around the room. In fact, I think some of the people have small blisters on... The view screen crackled and hissed, then went blank. Dr. Hess? Dr. Hess, come in. We have lost contact, Cadet Janeway. That is all for now, said Governor O'Neill. He sniffed at them once, turned on his heel, and walked away from the window. Kathryn tried to say, but Governor O'Neill and his officers continued to walk away. She looked at the others and noticed she wasn't the only one who was angry. Blynar started to pace back and forth while Laswa, Timothy, and Marie talked together in whispers. You're speaking strange whispers. Kathryn hadn't felt this helpless in a long time. And now that we're cut off from the ship and stuck in this room, she thought, looking around the great hall, who's going to help us?